What is that crap? You've spent all this time and effort digitizing a design only to start stitching it out and saying that. So in this video, I'm going to go through what registration means when it comes to machine embroidery. When your embroidery machine is stitching out a design, it follows the stitch path saved to the digitized file, maintaining placement relative to the first stitch made. This is referred to as registration. If you're monitoring your machine and notice that the stitches are starting to drift from where they should be placed, this is called deregistration, because you're losing registration. Sometimes it'll show up as the edge of a fill area's underlay, meaning the stitches laid down first that stabilize the area before filling it in with the denser stitches. Other times it'll rear its ugly head when you have an outline that doesn't necessarily walk the edge of the fill area. Deregistration can be incredibly frustrating. It leads to a lot of lost time and materials, which equates to lost money. But it's a solvable problem for future stitch outs. Deregistration is caused by a number of factors, but there's two major reasons for why it happens: incorrect stabilization and bad digitizing. I've already covered stabilizers and how to appropriately stabilize certain products in another video, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. I'll put a little flag up at the top and a link in the description below. This video is going to focus on the bad digitizing side of things. So without further ado, let's hop into Hatch. This is Hatch, the software that I prefer using for digitizing my embroidery designs. Most of the terms that I'm going to be using in this video are going to mirror terms in other digitizing software. However, there might be a couple of differences. Here I've opened one of my more popular beanie designs. Behold the llama! It's cute, ain't it? It's not so cute when that brown outline isn't where it's supposed to be, though. Lots and lots of wasted beanies. Apart from digitizing incorrectly, I didn't stabilize it correctly either. I had only used one layer of a lightweight cutaway. That's not enough when you're working with something as thick and as stretchy as a beanie cuff. So basically what happened was, as it was filling in the fur of the llama, it started to gradually pull the fabric inward. By the time it got to the outline, it was stitching in the completely wrong location. The machine thought that the fabric and the needle were in a different spot. Pretty much think of it as a moving target, or the rug being pulled out from under you. But like I said earlier, stabilizing is only part of the problem. So let's take a deeper look at the digitizing. First, let's cover design density. Density is defined by the spacing and the length of your stitches. The smaller the spacing and stitch length, the more dense the design is going to be. You need to strike a healthy balance between filling the area enough to hide the backing fabric and not making it so dense that it puckers. The problem with this design is that I made those fills way too dense. To fix it, I need to increase the spacing between stitches. I'll start by changing the spacing from 0.4 millimeters to 0.45 millimeters. I'll need to do this for all of the llama's fur fill areas. The next problem is the underlays of these fills. Each of the fur fill areas have two underlays, an edge run and a tatami fill. They're important for stabilizing the area with stitching before doing the main fill, but oftentimes the offset of the underlays are overly optimistic. In Hatch, each underlay has a margin setting. By default, it's set to normal, but you can change it to medium and wide to bring those fill margins closer to the center of the fill area. If we toggle off True View mode, you can see the margins change as I sort through the other options. I'm gonna stick with medium because I think wide might be a bit too much. If you're using a tatami underlay, you can also adjust the stitch length and space settings to reduce density, though usually they're already pretty sparse. Fill areas also have a setting called pull compensation. This is a very important setting for stitching to knits because it gives the fill area wiggle room for when the fabric is pulled, and it will be pulled. In Hatch, the default is set to 0.2 millimeters. I'm going to bump this value to 0.25 millimeters for all of my fill areas. You can see how the design is widening and shifting slightly to give me that wiggle room. And last but certainly not least, let's discuss my poor life choices. Why exactly did I use a triple stitch outline on something I knew was going to go onto a knit fabric? Something I ultimately knew was going to be pulled to the center. I was inexperienced. That's why. I've learned over the years that not every fill area needs an outline. The design is way too small for a satin stitch, even if the satin stitch were to give me a little bit more room for error. While stitched out to a more stable fabric like canvas or twill, this design would look great, but stitched to a knit, it's a nightmare. I can stabilize and adjust the stitching on the fill areas only so much. At some point, I have to admit, then an outline is a stupid idea. Instead of outlines, we can change the fill type and the angle of the ears to visually separate them from the head, which was really why I wanted the outline in the first darn place. Now let's take a look at the other design. This design is fairly simple, so the only real issue it has is the margin for the fill area's underlay. If we pop over to the stitching properties panel, we can adjust the margin for the edge run and the tatami fill. And just in case, I will also bump up the pull compensation to 0.25 millimeters. I'm going to toggle off the true view and zoom in and show you why I'm choosing medium for the underlay margins and not wide. See the points on the crescent moon? If I increase the margin to the widest setting, these points wouldn't be stable at all and could possibly warp or sink into the fabric. Since this is another one of my beanie designs, I know that's going to be a huge issue. So that's ultimately why I selected the medium margin setting. Remember that the underlay is just as important as stabilizer for keeping everything in place for the stitch out. Now you need to test these designs with the updated settings to make sure that everything is good before you proceed and do it on something more expensive. That's where I like to reuse the messed up beanies. Happy digitizing! If you're interested in more tips and tutorials just like this, feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel.